Good evening, students. Today we will be discussing the War of 1812 and how it led to American nationalism. You will be using Cornell notes in order to take notes on this lecture. Title in your notes, The War of 1812 and American Nationalism. Include the following in your notes and use the slide headings to help formulate questions about the notes. And include any vocab that you have left in the left-hand column. Things that I need you to include in the notes are what led to the war, the three distinct phases of the war, and what the aftermath of the war was. You will include a summary at the end of your notes, so please leave a space for that. Thank you. Now, as we discussed before, some of the major events that led up to the war was that the United States was not free to ship across the globe. It was being harassed and their cargo was being seized by both France and Great Britain. Britain required the Americans to have a license for all ships bound to Europe, so they knew it was going to England, and the French would confiscate any ship and any cargo that had a license or submitted to a British check. Also, on top of this, impressment. British ships were stealing citizens of the United States and impressing them back into the British Navy, where they would have to fight and serve as British sailors. Now, with Thomas Jefferson's desire to be left alone and be isolationist, he signed into law the Embargo Act of 1807, which halted all trade with Europe. The embargo would ban trade with any other country outside of the United States. It was very unpopular, especially in northern port cities like New York and Boston and Philadelphia, because trade was their primary source of income. The embargo was more damaging to the American economy in the short run, but eventually what it did was it helped force the Americans to fend for themselves in terms of industry and began creating items to satisfy their industrial needs. Thomas Jefferson hated his term as presidency. He felt that it was a failure, and he felt that it was the worst portion of his political career. He did not decide to run for a third term. In his stead, James Madison took over. He was Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State. Now, Madison was the author of 30 of the 81 Federalist Papers, including some of the most influential, like number 10 and number 51. He was also considered one of the most, if not the most important, contributor to the United States Constitution. He was also the shortest president at 5'3" and only 100 pounds. Now, he would continue Jefferson's legacy and hence continue the Jeffersonian era for another 8 years as being the Virginian representative as the President of the United States. Now, Madison was a very astute political man, and so his role in leading up to the War of 1812 was, number one, that he lifted the embargo of 1807 and replaced it with something called the Non-Intercourse Act. What this did was it only forbade trade with France and Britain. However, they could reintroduce trade with these two powers if the French and the British lifted their restrictions. This was highly unsuccessful because what it did was say that American merchants could leave American ports and trade wherever else in the world that they wanted except France and Britain. Now, France and Britain would not allow them to trade with other places and continued to force their own blockades and their own impressments and would not give up those issues. Now, many congressmen, especially the ones in the South and the West, were fed up with the way that they were being treated by both the British and the French, and they wanted war for these actions. Now, why did they want war? One, they were fed up, but two, they had their eyes on Canada. They wanted to expand in the British territory in Canada. What they felt that they were going to get out of war was, first off, it was going to reopen trade. Secondly, they could regain some national pride. The United States had never fought in a war since the Revolution, and they felt like they were being bullied by both the British and the French. They would also be able to stop the impressment of American sailors and get them back to their families in the United States. And lastly, They wanted Canada. They wanted more land to the north. They felt that the people there in Canada were more closely akin to us than they were to Britain, and therefore they would serve us and fight with us if we in fact invaded them. They felt that all they needed was a little push in the right direction for them to overthrow the British government. It's one thing to want to fight in a war, it's another thing to be ready to go to war, and the United States was not ready to go to war. The standing army was very small. There was only about 7,000 soldiers, and many of the officers were considered old and drunkards. The militias, well, they only wanted to fight in their own borders, and they definitely were not in favor of invading a country like Canada. They wanted to fight within their own states because, after all, they were state militias. And lastly, and most importantly, the Navy was quite small, and they only had 16 ships. Because of this size, we were not ready to compete with the British at sea or at land. And lastly, England used the intervening years between the Revolution and the War of 1812 to establish themselves once again as a fantastic superpower, and they were willing to destroy us to make up for the embarrassment suffered during the Revolution. Eventually, in June of 1812, forced after constant impressment of American citizens, James Madison decided that it was time to ask Congress for a declaration of war. The vote in Congress was split along regional lines, with most people along the East Coast and in the Northeast voting no. However, it did get its majority and passed. The war started first off with an invasion of Canada to seize Canada from the British. The war got off to a quick start with the United States invading Canada, quickly seizing the city of York and burning it to the ground. That is modern-day Toronto. The United States also figured Canadians would join their side to quickly expel the British from North America. However, this did not happen, period. While battle raged on land, it also raged in the water, in this case the Great Lakes. Oliver Hazard Perry defeated the British on Lake Erie and gave the United States control over that particular lake. While this was happening, the British blockaded the eastern seaboard. This was an attempt to further damage the United States economy by preventing shipping from leaving the eastern seaboard and not being allowed to ship or trade at all with Europe. The Americans were generally successful during this portion of the war because the British were still fighting the French in Europe and could not give the Americans their entire focus. This portion of the war also contained the final defeat of Tecumseh at the hands of William Henry Harrison at the Battle of Thames, finally destroying the ability of the Native Americans to have a Native American empire in the United States. The second phase of the war would take place in and around the Chesapeake Bay. It would happen with the British making landfall at Washington, D.C., capturing the city, burning the White House to the ground, as well as the Capitol building. President Madison and Congress are in fact caught off guard by this invasion and are barely able to escape the city, fleeing just a couple hours before the British are occupying the city and burning the city to the ground. Weirdly enough, the thing that removes the British from Washington, D.C. is not American forces at all, but the American weather, where a freak tornado and hurricane strike the city at the same time, decimating the British forces and forcing them to retreat back to the Chesapeake Bay, where they once again are able to get back onto their ships and renew their attacks elsewhere within the bay. After Washington, D.C., the next focal point for the British military was the nearby port city of Baltimore. Baltimore was a nest of pirates and ruffians. The Baltimoreans, however, were prepared for the British, unlike the residents of D.C. The city militia met the British out on the field of battle prior to allowing them to get to the city, and this forced the British to only be able to attack the city by water. In order to impede the British's ability to approach the city by water, city merchants took their vessels out and sunk them, creating a man-made barrier reef that kept the British offshore and past the Fort McHenry, which is in Baltimore Harbor. The British would have to settle for bombing the fort in an attempt to make it surrender so they could enter the harbor. Unfortunately for the British, after about 24 hours of shelling of the fort, they did not kill anybody inside, and they were forced to abandon the attack. A Washington, D.C. lawyer witnessed the attack aboard a British prison ship and penned the national anthem as he was inspired by the flag waving in the morning over Fort McHenry. After 2 years of battle and neither side being able to really make substantial gains, both sides decided that it was time for the war to end, and peace talks commenced in Ghent, Belgium in December of 1814, and were able to end on December 24th, 1814. The war would end in a stalemate, and no party would gain or lose territory. The issue of impressment was not addressed at all, but eventually would fade on its own, and British ships would stop taking American sailors. The last phase of battle was in the South, and specifically the Battle of New Orleans. This was fought actually after the treaty was signed, and what makes the Battle of New Orleans important was that it was a protection of our lifeline into the interior of our country, a protection of the city of New Orleans and the Mississippi River. American forces at the time were led by one Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a veteran of the Revolutionary War when he was just 13 years old. His forces were made up of primarily pirates and frontiersmen, along with small group of actual regular military. They did not face a huge British force, however, they were drastically outnumbered. Even though they were outnumbered, they were able to create defensive fortifications and get behind them and force the British to fight their way through a swamp and attack uphill, essentially. Riflemen were able to mow down over 2,000 British redcoats, while the defenders only suffered 70 casualties before the British were forced to surrender. This battle made Andrew Jackson a household name and a national hero, and he would eventually use this fame to become president. So if the war was a tie, why is it even important? Number one reason is it gave the United States a national identity. We were able to hold our own against the British. We were not going to be overwhelmed by them. It started us thinking about westward expansion. Instead of going north into Canada, we decided that we would use the land that we in fact owned already and move west across the Mississippi River and into the Louisiana Territory. It ended bad feelings towards the British, and the British would eventually abandon their forts that they held on the Great Lakes, and out of it created the national anthem, and this created patriotic feelings as well as nationalistic feelings that the United States was in fact the greatest. Lastly, two future presidents would use their fighting during the War of 1812 to spur them on to the presidency. First and foremost, Andrew Jackson as the hero of New Orleans, and lastly, William Henry Harrison as a hero of both the Battle of Tippecanoe and the Battle of the Thames. The War of 1812 in some ways was forgettable, but in other ways it allowed the United States to see the issues that it needed to fix. It allowed the United States to move into the future because it realized that they could not entirely depend on manufacturing in Europe, and it allowed the United States to have nationalistic pride that we in fact could hold ourselves against other major powers. So if you would please summarize your notes at the bottom of your paper and be ready to discuss tomorrow in class. Thank you.